Greetings. My name is Māhealani Uchiyama. I'm the director of the Center for International Dance. Welcome to Dare, Conversations in the Diaspora. Dare is a production of the African American Mbira Project, an initiative to perpetuate the music and tradition of the Mbira within the African American community. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I reside in the Bay Area, a land contemporarily known as Ohlone territory. There are 8 language dialects and many active tribal groups. With Dare, we aspire to explore the music of Zimbabwe and other performance traditions which exist in the diaspora. Our conversations with artists will focus on their art form and their personal journey. Additionally, you will have a chance to ask questions of our guests. Anesu Ndoro has been playing Zimbabwe's traditional music for as long as he can remember. First, learning from his family members before seeking out Mbira teachers, such as Sekuru Tutechigamba, Zibsai Chirikure, Forward Kwenda, and Sekuru Nutencheza Chozengwa. Anesu has carried out research on the accessibility of traditional instrument making and music playing among Zimbabwean youth. An international student at Reed College in Oregon, he is also interested in theories of cultural exchange as they pertain to Zimbabweans and Americans. Greetings, Anesu.
Hello, everyone. Let me start by saying Magadi to everyone who's tuned in. I'm really honored to be here, to be taking part in conversations like this. It's something that gives me a lot of joy when people are talking about music and heritage, but also kind of the complications that come with playing that music and sharing that music as well. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
We are delighted that you're here. Thank you so much. I know students have a lot of work to do, so we really appreciate you taking the time to sit with us today. So thank you, welcome, and I just want to jump right in and talk about the nature of your studies and the work that you are doing and the work that you are aspiring to continue. Seems to center on unpacking what it means to have ways of knowing centered on African perspectives and coming to terms with the history of colonization on the continent of Africa. And I wonder, with those thoughts in mind, if you could speak to us about your understanding of the spiritual significance of the Mbira.
Certainly. So perhaps starting with the first part of this question, which is my interest in sort of African perspective or knowledge production within the African context. I think one of the biggest consequences of colonization on the African continent has been the undermining of not only African perspectives, but also the forms of knowledge that exist on the continent. So one of the ways this happens is through the separation of what we would like to call formal knowledge and folk knowledge, which is a distinction that seems very innocent at first glance. But then the more you look at it, that separation sort of occurs within a number of kind of, and let's call them epistemological binaries that exist within the Western tradition of learning. So you have man versus nature, nature versus culture, and folk versus sort of like an institutional forms of knowing. And what that does is, instead of looking at African perspectives as knowledges within themselves that can be debated, that can be deployed, that can be used, we start to attach those forms of knowledge to a very specific kind of time. So African ways of knowing are old, they're outdated. Some might even say they're primitive, they're infantile. Whereas at least within the context of colonization, the Western tradition is more progressive, it's modern, and there's a project behind that. And so that separation is one of the things that I like to kind of toy around with, or at least complicate, in showing that it's more an issue of different kinds of knowledge as opposed to some like saying, oh, before colonization, this is how we used to think, and then colonization happened, and we suddenly became these modernized people who didn't have to engage with our African ways of knowing first. So that's something that I'm very interested in, which to the issue of the spiritual significance of African music, in many contexts, but Mbira music in this particular sort of conversation that we're having, part of the problem with, or rather, part of the reason why there is this kind of reluctance to acknowledge the spirituality of African music is, or Mbira music more specifically, is this idea that it's a non-modern way of looking at music making. Music making should be open. Music making should be looked at from the perspective of notes and harmonies, maybe modes and whatnot. But the spiritual aspect of it is treated as though it's something archaic, which goes back to that issue I was talking about of categorizing forms of knowledge along this sort of timeline, right? Sort of trapping their music in this very specific moment in time to say at one point maybe it was spiritual, but now we're past that, right? We're no modern people. We don't have to engage with that. And that's something that there's something very insidious through those kinds of thoughts, because in denying the spirituality of their music, we are denying the context in which that music ought to be played, which is in Mapira, in order for us for Shona people to communicate with our ancestors. And in doing so, we're almost trying to get the instrument and kind of sever it from all these other things that like grow from it, right? Mbira is not just people coming, they play the music and whatnot. It is a site for kinship construction and reinforcement. It's where social hierarchies are acknowledged or contested. It is a site where people get to remember their history, remember their past, but also acknowledge their present, sort of in lieu of what might happen in their future. So a lot of things happen within the Mbira, but separating Mbira from that spiritual context is, there's something, it's a form of denial of the Africanness of the instrument itself. Because to do that, you have to rely on very Western epistemologies about how music works. That the spiritual and the musical can be separated in that way, which is not how the music works. So, yeah, I'll stop there.
No, that's it just calls to mind also how there's different ways of approaching learning and sharing and being with the music. This sense of I think in the African sense, knowledge is more something to share freely, whereas in the Western sense, it's something that you claim and put your name on and maybe try to make money off of it. And when the two perspectives meet, it's not an equal footing in that way.
Yeah.
Am I making sense?
Yeah, definitely. And that's why it's important to acknowledge, or at least to recognize that our social interactions as they're happening today, our cultural exchanges, our ways of playing or understanding music aren't happening in a vacuum. That the colonial history that Zimbabwe has shapes how we think about our music and how we interact with it. And so, indeed, when people are faced with a case in which you have to choose, or almost, and that's what it often feels like, is you're feeling like you have to choose between how the music is understood in Zimbabwe versus how perhaps within a Western sort of tradition of music, that music ought to be understood. You feel like these two are being pitted against each other, and more often than not, the sort of like spiritual aspects of the music, or the African perspective upon the music, is often cast aside in that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in Zimbabwe, Mbira basically happens in a family setting, in ceremony, in the morning before you go off and start your day, or it's more, it seems more of a functional kind of experience that is just a part of how daily living is conducted. And please stop me if I'm going off on a weird tangent. But where I'm trying to get at is your thoughts about how the music might change when the method of transferring the knowledge of it moves from a functional setting to the classroom, or a functional setting to learning it as part of being involved in a festival, or in a way that's different than how it might have been transferred in times before.
That's a very good question. And also, perhaps this might be like a good moment to talk about. So it isn't so much an issue of Mbira music cannot enter new contexts, there is no freedom in sort of people reimagining the context in which we can be using Mbira music. It's an interesting thing that people do is Mbira music in folktales. People are taking Mbira music into rap music. People are doing all sorts of things. And indeed, even the movement of the Mbira music, from learning it from your elders or your older brothers or cousins or sisters and whatnot, and that moving into a classroom setting is a significant change in context. The issue isn't the change itself as much as it is how much control, let's say, do African people have within the shifting context of the music that they make? I think is an important question. But the issue isn't as the music moves into the classroom as much as it is when the music has moved into the classroom, is the African perspective still there? Mm. Is that functionality of the music, is it being taught and is it being honored? Or are we now saying because the music has moved into the classroom, it is no longer necessary for that functional part to be there? Mm. So the context moving isn't always necessarily a bad thing, as much as it is the dynamics of who gets to control the music, who gets to play it, who gets to consume it. Those things start to change. And they often change, and oftentimes our elders are at a disadvantage, because as we were talking about earlier, their depth, the depth of their knowledge, mm-hmm. the weight of their knowledge is not seen on par with someone who has a master's or a PhD in ethnomusicology or in music training. Their knowledge is seen as folk, and so one learning from one's elder is not seen with the same weight as one learning the music in a classroom. And so even the opportunities that can avail themselves to those two different kinds of students are very different. So that issue of sort of the transmission of the music from either from the Mbira to the concert, either from learning from your elder to learning from like a lecturer or such, those I think are sort of like changes within the music that we even ought to welcome. Those are new spaces in which we can be exploring the music, but it has to be done in a way where we don't end up denying sort of parts of ourselves in order to fit into this category of modernity that is these stipulations about how knowledge ought to be created and consumed.
How did you start playing Mbira? How old were you? Tell us about that.
So when I say it for as long as I can remember, it really is that. My grandfather was a Mbira musician, and my grandmother, both on my mother's side, was a dancer, a singer, a spiritual leader. Mm-hmm. And so the instrument was always in the family. Unfortunately, my grandfather passed away before I was born. Mm-hmm. So by the time I was born, the instrument was there, just kind of being passed around to his grandchildren. And some of my cousins had been learning a couple of things, and I started picking it up from them. But it wasn't really until I was in high school where I was now able to at least visit some of the Mbira players you were talking about. These, I owe so much of what I have come to know and some of the people who I've come to know from them, because they pointed me in the right directions of, oh, if you want to know more about this, you should go and talk to La Chingodza, or you should go to talk to Sekuru Chigamba, or Sekuru Chirukure knows about this. And it was also at a moment in time where I didn't necessarily have, let's say, the capital. And these are other problems that are also kind of like people face as they try to learn the music. I didn't always have the capital to travel and live with Mbira players. I live in Chegutu, which is a small town that's about an hour and a half, 2 hours drive out of the capital, which is where a lot of Mbira players were. So I could only visit people for a short amount of time, and sometimes you try to record things with your phone. But I felt like that was basically sort of like in that period, it was much more me trying to grab at the little bits and pieces of knowledge that I could get my hands on. And partly maybe this is why I feel very strongly about the subject, is there's an issue of accessibility there that I experienced myself in trying to learn this music. Was I grew up in an urbanized sort of town, so it was very much different from the sort of a typical context in which maybe you are growing up kumusha with your aunts and uncles and your grandparents, and you have your neighbors who know how to play, and you can apprentice with them, which is often how it is with people moving into the cities. Like those kinds of changes started as early as like the 1920s, with people moving to go into work in the mines, in mining towns and the like. That kind of created a breakage of like family bonds, and created a situation in which it was difficult for people to spend a lot of time together, so sort of like to learn. And so that's kind of where I started, was really just bouncing around from person to person, trying to grab as little or as much knowledge as I could. And then towards like after I had finished high school and just before I came to the US, that's when I really started to kind of spend more time with Mbira players and learning from them. And then when I came to the US, I was fortunate enough to come to Portland, where a lot of Zimbabwean teachers often pass through. And that was quite a wonderful sort of, I guess, the cosmos has created that kind of situation where I was able to meet Amai Chaiteshi, Amai Njeri. I was able to meet Vachingodza. I was able to meet Sekuru Magaya before he passed away, and learn quite a lot from them just by by being in the proximity of them and watching how they're teaching others here in the US, and also asking questions when you have them. So it's really a difficult question for me to answer, because I feel that I've been playing for as long as I can, but the way that I've come to learn hasn't been very typical for most people. I feel it's mostly because of the fact that I grew up in a town where there weren't that many Mbira players to begin with, or none that I knew of. And even though the outlying sort of like area, like peri-urban areas, had more Mbira players, I didn't have access to even know that the people were playing Mbira in Mondoro or in Gezi or in Ruizi, which are very close to Chegut, but just from not knowing that those people existed, you're already cut off from potential knowledge that you could have learned from.
Mm-hmm. I just want to mention, if for anyone who's watching, feel free to put a question in the conversation bar underneath if you have a question for our guest, and I'll be happy to forward that along. But you mentioned some of the women in your family. It's not very common, is it, for women to play Mbira in Zimbabwe as it is for men? I mean, there are certainly some very powerful women Mbira players, some of whom I know personally. But that said, it's still not as common for women to play Mbira. I wonder, what are your thoughts about that dynamic, the dynamic of gendered hierarchies and of disseminating knowledge with regard to women?
Yeah. I think it's always important. In as much as I can talk about this, I don't want anyone to take this as me speaking from, or at least trying to speak on behalf of Zimbabwean women. I think my perspectives come from my own observations about how these things happen, but it's always important for us to seek those perspectives from Zimbabwean women themselves. But if I am to talk about the dynamics behind this, again, I can speak even from sort of my own family, where even as this instrument that I'm talking about that belonged to my grandfather, even as I was trying to learn it and my cousins were trying to learn it, there was always a discouragement towards my sisters and my cousin sisters learning that same instrument. Sometimes it would come as jokes, with aunts saying things like, "Oh, if you play Mbira, no one will marry you," or things like that. Or it could really be sometimes just saying, "Don't play the instrument, let the boys play the instrument, and don't do that." Mm. And sometimes these things, they start to layer. So you have a situation whereby, because of sort of the social expectations that women have in Zimbabwe, where there's kind of a double labor, right? People are supposed to go to work, but when people come back from work, women have all these expectations that they have to cook, or they have to clean within the house and the like, such that that time in which all these chores are being done, all these this household labor is being performed, the men are learning the instruments. Mm-hmm. They aren't being held to that same kind of expectation that you have the labor that you do outside of the home at your work, but that there is labor you're supposed to do in the household as well. And so then there's a question of, it's not so much women, not only there being a social stigma towards women playing Mbira, it's also an issue of social conditions being such that there isn't time, that women are in performing this kind of double labor. There isn't time for women to engage in music making, in music playing. This isn't to say that women cannot do that. Very clearly, with many examples of very talented Mbira players who've made it and who've created so much space for Mbira players in general to be playing abroad. Like Mbira Chiweshe, Ateta Irene Chigamba, Amai Njeri. We have all these examples of women who can play Mbira and who do so exceptionally, but more should be done. And I think one thing that I'm quite happy with is it's a conversation that a lot of people are reacting very positively in Zimbabwe. I think a lot of people know of Chioniso Maraire, they know Hope Masike, they know Tendai Marengeni, who are all like young women who are also sort of setting the place of Mbira playing within Zimbabwe. And people are being very receptive to that because I think people realize that this is that these kinds of like sort of like expectations that we had of like, oh, women are supposed to engage with this or that, that it is in a real sense time that we moved past those kinds of ideas. And this is kind of like tying into this idea of modernity and tradition is we also have to be careful in how we articulate it. Because oftentimes when we talk about this, we often say, oh, it's just tradition, right? Women aren't supposed to play Mbira because it is tradition. Mm-hmm. And when we do that, we fail to recognize the real ways in which women are being kept from playing Mbira. Mm-hmm. It's not just an issue of, it's an idea that people have. It's so much more that there is the actual barriers in place that make it difficult. And by just saying it's tradition, we fail to name those specific things and kind of try to undo them. So it makes much more sense for us to say, or at least to look at the real ways in which that kind of music making is being hindered, and then try to counter that with. I know people find like there are many people who run culture centers who are centering on teaching women how to play very specifically, and I think those kinds of like initiatives where we make deliberate efforts are really important.
So I have a question about the globalization of Mbira, but I actually would like to invite you to share some music with us, and then we can talk about how that fits in.
Certainly. So in the spirit of taking sort of these very important songs that we have within Mbira making and Mbira music making, I've been doing some experiments with the auto harp. I came across the auto harp kind of by accident, and I really liked the sound. And so I'm going to try and play Bukatiende. Bukatiende is a song that is played on the Mbira, and I'm going to play sort of a transposition that I have of it onto the auto harp. So hopefully people will enjoy. So that was Bugaiti Ende.
That's so cool. On an auto harp. I love auto harp music. It would have never occurred to me to try to figure out how to do that. That is really amazing.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I am not the best singer. So
it's me. No, it was lovely. Thank you so much. And we're going to get back to my thoughts on globalization, but I do want to share a question that has come in from Marilyn, one of our really dear community members. She asks, is there much change happening generally in women's roles in Zimbabwe?
I'd like to give an optimistic yes, but also sort of ground my answers in kind of the realities that do exist. I'll say there is some change happening. Mm-hmm. It used to be the case, for example, that sending girls to school wasn't a priority for a lot of families. A lot of fathers would rather invest within the education of their sons instead of the education of their daughters. For anyone who's read Tsidanga was nervous conditions. This is one of the biggest kind of plot points was this idea that Namo was I want to say the son of the family. He was able to go to school at the expense of his sisters. That has changed. You have like a push by the government, by a lot of organizations to create opportunities for women to go to school, to get an education. It also used to be the case that if women worked, their money was supposed to be given to their husband as well. Mm-hmm. That's something that is changing. Women have a lot more financial sort of independence than perhaps in generations past. But that's not to say that they have total financial freedom or that education levels between men and women in Zimbabwe are the same. And that's what I mean by sort of grounding it in the realities, to say progress is being made, but there is still a lot to work with. We have a lot of issues in terms of, it could be gender-based violence. It could be issues of sexual assault. The courts oftentimes, in fact, are not doing enough to kind of give verdicts that protect women. It could be in issues of positions of leadership. Positions of leadership are still very much male-dominated. And I think for most Zimbabweans, pointing these things is not controversial at all. I think it's something people acknowledge. But acknowledging it is not enough. At the end of the day, something needs to be done. And one thing that I'm really happy, at least optimistic about, is it seems as if people in my generation, and even the generation of my parents, are much more open to sort of taking steps towards more equality for all people who live in the country. And that in itself, I think, is an important thing. But Zimbabwe, and again, like, not to sort of hone in too much on this issue, but Zimbabwe's particular history with colonization is always important to think about and consider if we're talking about these kinds of things. That the way labor migrations worked, the way legislation worked, the way even the liberation movement worked, right? And how much women were included in that are all important if when all of those things start compounding in who gets to learn music, for example, or who gets to go to school, who gets to hold a position of power. So I think optimism is there, but certainly there's still a lot to be done, and I think a lot of people are invested within making things better.
Awesome. It's interesting to see how the rest of the world views this music. And in some cases, the dynamic of what is happening reminds me of what happened with some African American forms of music, such as jazz, or I think maybe more pointedly, the early banjo tradition in this country, in that the music was created in one community and then sort of became commodified in another community to the point of near erasure of the community of origin being at all present in or associated with the music. You just gave us this beautiful, amazing performance on an auto harp of a traditional Mbira song. Can you speak to your thoughts about what happens to the Mbira in the face of globalization and who gets to do what?
That I think is a very important question. Is one of the things that I think the Zimbabweans, but just everyone on the African continent in general, has to reckon with is that things are changing. Right? Seguru Chigamba plays a very poignant song, Pasim Pindu, right? The earth is kind of turning on itself. People in Dandim Tandi, another song, right? There are now all these webbed connections that are connecting people together more than it was even 50, 100 years ago. Suddenly people are interacting more. And I think often when we start having these conversations, the anxiety behind it is that, well, we want to play this music. Does this mean that like I can't play Mbira? That's how people often approach these conversations. Is when you're talking about this, does this mean that I cannot play Mbira? And I think that it's telling in a way that in people's concerns that the particular histories of African peoples, of Zimbabweans, and kind of the way that cultural exchanges have been happening, where Mbira music was banned by law under colonization, people's instruments were confiscated, playing the instrument could get you flogged or even jailed. Mapira, which is the primary way in which a core social institution in which people were able to commune with their ancestors, constitute their being, that those were practices that were demonized by law, not like as a social attitude, but it was on the books that these kinds of things couldn't happen. I think it's telling that when people's concerns are, we want to play this music, but we want to do it in a way that we share it responsibly, that a person's reaction would be, well, what about me? Is a very self-centered reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important that we point that out, that when people are talking about the concerns that they have with like the dissemination or the sharing of particular aspects of their culture, the first thing you should be doing is listening to what they're saying before reacting defensively. And oftentimes online is a lot of things that people do is very defensive reactions of how can I be appropriating, how can I be taking advantage, how can I be exploiting, without necessarily understanding what people are saying about that. So maybe that's the very first thing maybe we need to like point out is the fact that like listening to each other when we're talking about these things is very important. Like we say you need to listen, but I think people take that for granted. And then in terms of the actual sharing itself, I think it's not new for Mbira music to be leaving the context of the Mbira. Thomas Mapfumo has an icon within the Zimbabwean music community, very distinctly known for taking these traditional tunes and playing them on guitar. People taking the Mbira and playing all sorts of compositions, right? This was happening as far as the 80s, where you can listen to records. In fact, further back, right? We can go as far back as I can think of recordings made that are at the International Library of African Music from the 1950s and 40s of people playing popular music on Jari and on Mbira. It's not necessarily a new phenomenon for people to be playing this music outside of its context, although sometimes we act as though it is. I think what's new is that it is now much easier for someone to take something, repackage it, and sell it and commodify it in a way that it becomes unrecognizable, both to the community that created the cultural artifact, so to say, and to the people consuming it. I'm thinking about this very recent case that happened with people who were trying to recreate mahjong, making it more, they say, to want to make it more palatable by removing all the Chinese characters from the tiles and making it pink and whatnot. And that kind of commodification has nothing to do with honoring a culture. And that's always the question people have to ask is, if I'm doing this, who will benefit in the end of the day? And that's a question that like requires a lot of honesty, and oftentimes we don't want to ask ourselves that question: is it really benefiting the people from whom I've taken this, or am I benefiting from it? And sometimes I often think that like we are the easiest people to lie to. Like we can lie to ourselves and convince ourselves that I'm not doing any harm. Maybe those people are, but certainly not me. But there's a certain level of introspection that needs to be done when playing or engaging in these kinds of things. I often favor collaboration. I think collaborations are always the best way. If you are doing something new and you work with Zimbabweans and you honor sort of like the significance of the music and where it comes from, I don't think people have a problem with that so much as it is taking an instrument and pretending as if it has no history, it has no name, it has no personality. There's something very grotesque about that kind of dynamic.
So what advice can you offer to those of us in the diaspora who are attempting to create connections to the motherland, strengthen our connections, learning the music, learning the dance, learning how to speak? What advice would you give us?
Certainly, of course, it's a complex question. Like there is no one correct response. I think it often it really does depend not only on who is trying to learn, but from whom they're trying to learn. If you are trying to learn kora music, from Mali, the kinds of conversations happening in that community are very different from the ones happening in Mbira, even though both are African instruments that maybe people in the diaspora want to learn. And certainly I think, at least in the context of Mbira, I think one important thing is to try, if possible, to not just learn the music in the sense of these are the notes that I am supposed to play and so forth, but really to try and understand where this music is coming from and form relationships with teachers. If you can learn from Zimbabweans, that is wonderful, but I also recognize that that is not possible for everyone. Sometimes you live far away, sometimes there are Zimbabweans around, and I don't think anyone would fault you for still learning Mbira music, even if you're learning it from people who are not from Zimbabwe. Your intention is you want to eventually make a relationship with this music and with the people who create this music. I think, yeah, it really does depend on the community itself. And certainly as a person who hasn't grown up in the diaspora, I can only speak as someone who's outside. I think like the complications that come from trying to make a connection with the motherland in that way is something that I certainly I haven't really had sort of like to think about that, because I just grew up in Zimbabwe, and then when I came to the United States, that's when I became sort of like exposed to these kinds of conversations. So part of me feels that I can say a lot, but at the end of the day, I can only speak as someone who hasn't really sort of stayed in the diaspora for that long. So I think just through being respectful, I really do think, and I really do believe that a lot of people play this music want to share it. I don't think it's a case of people not wanting to share it, but I think people have genuine concerns about the ethics behind how that music is shared, and I think taking those concerns seriously, right? When people say don't share this thing that I've taught you, then take what your teacher has said seriously. If a person says, be sure to mention that I have taught you this, then be sure to do that. Taking your teachers as just that, as teachers, and kind of a callback to what we were talking about earlier, respecting their knowledge, as having depth and as having sort of like weight, and not just some folk thing you can do one day and leave the next. But that it's a knowledge that is intimately tied to the spiritual, the emotional, and the social, and that it is a music that creates and reproduces the society that plays it. I think it's very important to acknowledge and to take seriously.
Beautiful. So what are your plans when you're done with your studies?
That is a good question. Currently, I have several applications just floating in the air. My hope is to get a PhD in anthropology. Anthropology is certainly not a field without its faults. In fact, colonization really probably would not have taken as much of a step as it was if it wasn't in collaboration with all these different academic fields that justified it, and anthropology was certainly one of them. But one of the things that I want to say in anthropology for is I think a field that at least has offered me some tools that I can use to better explain some of the things that I see, and not only explain what I see, but at least begin to undo some of the damage that like has been done to many societies in Southern Africa and abroad. And so like that's really what I want, at least I hope to do, is for it not just to be bookish knowledge, but for it to be knowledge that I am taking knowledge that exists within the West, and I'm putting it in conversation with knowledge that exists on the African continent, and seeing whether we can begin to heal and reconstruct ourselves using all these different kinds of tools at our disposal. So that's kind of my hope, is to go on to get a PhD if possible, and if not, we'll just see where things go. But certainly that's my hope, is to kind of continue with this work, because I think there's a lot that we can gain from that.
Well, I think there's certainly a lot that our community will benefit from your work. So we're really grateful to you for stepping up and stepping in and doing this grounding for us of different knowledge bases, and helping us to recontextualize a lot of what we take for granted that we probably shouldn't take for granted. So I want to commend you for that. I also want to thank you so much for participating in Dare, Conversations in the Diaspora. And I wish you all the best of luck with your school year, and with your efforts to continue on to get your PhD. So thank you so much, Anesu.
Shinde.
Thank you. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Most definitely.
And I also want to thank our viewers for joining us today, and to those who submitted questions. Dare, Conversations in the Diaspora, is a program of the Māhealani Uchiyama Center for International Dance, a nonprofit organization dedicated to fostering cross-cultural understanding in our community through dance and music. The African American Mbira project is supported in part by grants from the City of Berkeley Civic Arts Program and the San Francisco Foundation, and by generous donors like you. We'd like to encourage you to consider a donation to our nonprofit following the link on your screen. And we will be back next month on April 3rd at 2 p.m. with Zena Carlota, an African-American kora player, storyteller, and ancestral song keeper, inspired by the Jalia music tradition of West Africa. Until then, be well, stay safe, and keep the music in your heart.